Sometimes you feel the change before anything has changed. The same people are still in your life. The same routine still runs on schedule. Nothing has officially ended. No door has closed. No announcement has been made. And yet, somewhere underneath all of that, something in you has already moved. You notice it in small places first. A friendship that still looks the same on the outside, but feels different when you're in it. A room that goes tense before anyone says a difficult word. A goal you worked years for that suddenly feels hollow when you finally hold it. A role you've played so long, it used to feel like skin, now feels like a costume. Someone's words are exactly the words they always use, but their tone doesn't match anymore. And you can't explain why that bothers you so much. You sense an ending, but you couldn't tell anyone what is ending. You feel pulled toward silence, toward distance, toward being alone with your own thoughts. And you don't know why solitude suddenly feels necessary instead of optional. Here's the reversal worth sitting with. This does not mean you can predict the future. It probably means your unconscious has already noticed something that your conscious mind hasn't organized into language yet. The perception came first. The explanation is still catching up. So here's the question underneath this entire video. What if the very quality that makes you feel uncertain right now is the same quality that lets you notice change before it becomes visible to anyone else? By the end of this, you'll understand why certain people seem to feel a shift before there's any proof of it, what Jungian psychology says about that kind of perception, how to tell real intuition apart from ordinary fear, and what to actually do when your inner world has already changed and your outer life hasn't caught up. Let's start with what this actually feels like, because before it has a name, it only has a texture. Conversations that used to feel spontaneous suddenly feel rehearsed, like both people are reciting lines they memorized in a version of the relationship that no longer exists. A morning routine that once felt comforting now feels like static, technically functioning, emotionally empty. You feel a strange distance from people who haven't done anything wrong. You develop a new, almost physical intolerance for pretending, for small talk that isn't true, for performances you used to give without thinking twice. You want to withdraw, not out of sadness exactly, but out of some quieter instinct to stop spending yourself on things that no longer register as real. Sometimes there's a grief with no clear object, a mourning for something you can't name yet, and underneath it all, a strange sense that somewhere inside you, a decision has already been made, even though you haven't consciously made any decision at all. Some changes happen internally, long before life gives them a name. That's worth repeating, because it explains almost everything else in this video. The event hasn't happened, the paperwork isn't signed, the conversation hasn't taken place. But something has already shifted in how you relate to your own life, and that shift is real even before it has evidence. Notice, too, how often this shows up as a change in tolerance rather than a change in circumstance. The job hasn't changed, but your capacity to sit through another meeting that goes nowhere has quietly disappeared. The friend hasn't changed, but your patience for the version of the conversation you've had a dozen times before has run out. Nothing about the external structure has moved, and yet your relationship to it has become almost unrecognizable from the inside. Which raises the obvious question. If something has already changed, why does the conscious mind seem to be the last one to know? The conscious mind has a job, and that job is continuity. It maintains the ongoing story of who you are, what your relationships mean, where your life is headed, what is safe, and what belongs to you. It resists rewriting that story, unless it absolutely has to, because rewriting it is expensive. It costs certainty, comfort, and the sense of a stable self. Meanwhile, underneath that story, the unconscious keeps registering the details the conscious mind would rather not deal with yet. Contradictions, repeated patterns, small emotional shifts that don't fit the narrative, desires that haven't been given permission to exist. None of this gets filed away and forgotten. It accumulates. The conscious mind often receives the news after the unconscious has already lived through the beginning. This is where Jungian intuition becomes useful to actually understand, instead of using it as a vague, mystical word. In a Jungian sense, intuition isn't magic, and it isn't fortune-telling. It's a specific way of processing information. The capacity to perceive patterns, possibilities, and directions before they're available to step-by-step conscious reasoning. It's not that intuitive people know something impossible. It's that they process many small signals faster than they can consciously narrate them. You notice a change in how someone pauses before answering. You sense a relationship growing quietly colder in a way that has nothing to do with any single argument. You feel an old ambition go flat, even though nothing about the ambition itself has changed. You perceive the direction a situation is heading before anyone states it out loud. You catch meaning in a cluster of small details that, individually, would mean nothing at all. Intuition recognizes a pattern before it can always explain the pattern. That's the whole mechanism. It's ahead of language, not ahead of reality. And this matters enormously. Intuition offers a signal, not proof. It tells you where to look. It does not tell you what you will find when you get there. Confusing those two things is where a lot of people go wrong, and we'll come back to that. Think of it less as a message, and more as a weather sense. Someone who has spent years outdoors can feel a storm building from a shift in air pressure long before the sky changes color. They're not predicting the future in any mystical sense. They're reading a set of signals so quickly and so automatically that it feels instantaneous, even though it's built entirely from accumulated experience. Psychological intuition works the same way. It is fast pattern recognition, not a message from somewhere beyond the self. So why do certain people seem to pick up on this earlier and more consistently than others? Not because they're chosen, and not because they're superior. It comes down to a specific combination of traits working together. A strong habit of inner observation, sensitivity to tone and to pauses, discomfort with contradiction, a rich internal world they spend real time inside of, a natural pull toward pattern recognition, a tolerance for ambiguity most people find unbearable, unusually detailed emotional memory, a tendency to reflect rather than react, and an ongoing awareness of their own shifting motivations. This isn't one official personality type, and this video isn't claiming it is. What rare personality means here is an uncommon combination of perception, introspection, intuition, and the willingness to look at uncomfortable truths instead of looking away from them. Rare does not mean superior. It means unusually attentive to what most people overlook. That distinction matters, because this video isn't here to flatter you into thinking you're special. It's here to explain a mechanism, and to be honest about its risks. Part of that mechanism is introversion in the Jungian sense, not in the popular sense. It isn't shyness, and it isn't about how many parties you attend. It's an orientation toward inner meaning, reflection, imagination, memory, emotional nuance, subjective interpretation. A person oriented this way spends a significant portion of their psychological life turned inward, which means internal change often registers for them well before any external change does. You might notice that your values have quietly shifted, that an old ambition no longer excites you the way it used to, that your social role has started to feel false in ways you can't fully articulate, that your relationship with solitude has changed, that something once tolerable now feels genuinely impossible to keep tolerating. The outer life may look identical, while the inner life has already changed direction. That gap between the two is often where the discomfort lives, and it's also where the persona starts to strain. In Jungian psychology, the persona is the social identity you build for belonging, for safety, for approval. It's not fake, exactly. It's functional. It's the mask that lets you move through the world without renegotiating your entire self in every interaction. But masks require energy, and that energy cost isn't fixed. It grows. You often notice the shift first when you can no longer comfortably perform the role you've been playing. The agreeable one, the strong one, the one who always succeeds, the caretaker who never runs low, the calm one who doesn't panic, the one who never seems to need anything from anyone. The version of you that other people find easy to understand because it never surprises them. You often feel the shift first when the role starts requiring more energy than the truth. That line is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's often the earliest, clearest signal that something underneath is already moving. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from this, one that has nothing to do with how much sleep you've had. It's the tiredness of translating yourself constantly, of editing every reaction before it's allowed to be seen. For a long time, the persona and the self overlap closely enough that the performance doesn't feel like a performance at all. The strain arrives later, gradually, when the gap between the two widens enough to notice. That widening gap is often one of the earliest, most reliable signs that something underneath is already in motion. At the same time, something else tends to surface during this kind of transition, and Jung called it the shadow. The parts of the personality that got rejected, suppressed, or simply never given room to exist. During periods of internal change, shadow material tends to return, sometimes without an obvious invitation. This can look like anger that seems to arrive from nowhere, envy you're embarrassed to admit, a restlessness you can't sit still with, resentment toward people who haven't done anything new, dreams that suddenly feel more vivid or more disturbing, a sharper emotional sensitivity than usual, a new, almost intolerable reaction to dishonesty in other people. Desires you'd quietly buried, starting to speak up again. None of this automatically proves that a life change is coming. It may simply mean that neglected psychological material is finally asking for attention. What feels like a warning from the future may sometimes be a neglected part of the present asking to be heard. This is one of the places where perceptive people get it wrong, not because their perception failed, but because they misassign the source. And that brings us to the section that matters most in this entire video, because it's the difference between insight and self-sabotage. How do you tell intuition apart from anxiety when they can feel almost identical in the body? There are useful differences, even if they aren't a perfect test. Intuition tends to be quiet, specific, and steady. Anxiety tends to be repetitive, urgent, catastrophic, and physically agitating. Intuition tends to say, something here is different. Anxiety tends to say, everything is about to go wrong. Intuition can sit with uncertainty without needing to resolve it immediately. Anxiety demands certainty right now and will manufacture a story just to get it. Intuition notices. Anxiety narrates. That's not a diagnostic formula you can apply mechanically to every feeling. Life is rarely that tidy, and the two frequently show up tangled together in the same moment. But the distinction gives you somewhere to start looking, instead of treating every uncomfortable feeling as equally trustworthy, which leads directly into projection. Because this is where even accurate perceivers can misread the very thing they're good at noticing. In Jungian psychology, projection is the process of placing internal material onto something external, and then experiencing it as if it originated out there. You might believe you're detecting a real, external change, while what you're actually doing is placing old abandonment fears, old distrust, old shame, a past betrayal, an unmet desire, a buried resentment, or a private hope onto a present situation that hasn't actually confirmed any of it. You assume silence means rejection. You read a delayed reply as emotional withdrawal. You interpret ordinary boredom as some kind of destiny. You treat attraction as if it were evidence. You decide that discomfort automatically means a relationship has to end. You start reading coincidence as confirmation of something you already wanted to believe. Sometimes what feels like a new truth is an old wound wearing new clothes. This is exactly why self-questioning isn't a weakness in perceptive people. It's the mark of real, psychological maturity. The ability to notice a pattern is only half the skill. The willingness to interrogate your own interpretation of that pattern is the other half, and it's the half most people skip. It's worth pausing here to say something fair about people who don't seem to notice the shift at all, because this video isn't interested in making anyone feel superior to anyone else. People often miss internal signals for understandable reasons. They're oriented toward external facts. They avoid discomfort as a general strategy. They depend on routine for a sense of safety. They're invested in a role staying exactly as it is. They only trust what can be clearly and immediately explained. They're afraid of what it would mean to admit something has changed, or they simply distract themselves before the signal can fully land. People often miss the shift, not because they're less intelligent, but because recognizing it would require them to change. That's not a flaw unique to other people. It's a universal defense, and perceptive people are not immune to it either. Sometimes they use their intuition selectively, noticing what's safe to notice and quietly avoiding what isn't. This brings us to one of the most disorienting stages of the entire process. The stretch of time where the old life still looks completely normal from the outside, but nothing about it feels normal on the inside anymore. The relationship looks the same, but it feels different when you're actually inside it. The goal still exists on paper, but it feels empty when you reach toward it. The identity you've worn for years suddenly feels outdated, like clothing that used to fit. The environment that used to feel like enough now feels too small to hold what you've become. You go through your own routine, feeling strangely absent from it, like a guest in your own schedule. The hardest transitions are the ones your inner life has begun, but your outer life has not yet acknowledged. There's no shortcut through that gap. But there is a wrong way to handle it, and it's worth naming clearly, because perceptive people are especially prone to this mistake. The danger is forcing meaning onto every feeling, turning every emotion into supposed evidence of a transformation. That looks like quitting impulsively, cutting people off abruptly, treating a dream as a literal instruction, chasing signs everywhere you look, making decisions in a hurry because a feeling arrived with intensity, assuming that discomfort automatically proves destiny, or believing that every intuitive flicker must be correct simply because it was intuitive. Forcing meaning doesn't reveal truth. Often, it manufactures a self-fulfilling pattern where you create the very crisis you thought you were merely detecting. A real shift does not need to be exaggerated in order to be real. So how do you tell the difference between a genuine shift and a passing emotional weather pattern? There are subtler, more reliable markers, and they tend to share a few qualities. The feeling persists over time instead of fading with a good night's sleep. It becomes clearer the longer you sit with it rather than more dramatic. Multiple unrelated areas of your life start pointing toward the same underlying issue. Old motivations keep weakening no matter how much you try to reignite them. You become less willing to betray yourself just to keep the peace. Your reactions start to feel more honest, less performed. You find you can describe what's happening with more precision than you could a month earlier. You get calmer as you accept it, not more agitated. You remain willing to examine evidence that contradicts your own interpretation instead of defending it at all costs. And critically, the feeling is still there, even after you've rested, regulated your nervous system, and given yourself time to calm down. Anxiety tends to lose its grip once the body settles. A genuine shift tends to remain quiet and intact, even after the noise clears. So what do you actually do with all of this? Once you suspect something in you has already changed, slow down before you act. Write down specifically what has actually changed. In plain language, separate the facts from your interpretation of the facts, because those are two very different documents. Watch the pattern over time instead of reacting to a single instance of it. Ask direct questions of the people involved, instead of only interpreting their behavior from a distance. Test your intuition against reality wherever you can, rather than treating the feeling itself as final proof. Protect real time for solitude, because that's where this kind of perception actually gets to finish processing. Resist the pull toward impulsive action. Notice which emotional themes keep repeating, because repetition is data. Talk to people you actually trust, and let them challenge your read on things. Ask yourself honestly whether fear or desire is quietly shaping your interpretation. And when you do act, take small, responsible steps, rather than dramatic, irreversible ones. Your job is not to prove that the shift is real. Your job is to become honest enough to discover what it is asking of you. None of this needs to happen quickly. There's a common assumption that once you sense something has changed, you owe the world an immediate, visible response, as if noticing were the same as being obligated to act. It isn't. Verification takes time, and time is not the same thing as avoidance. A perceptive person who waits, watches, and tests what they've noticed is not being cowardly. They're doing the second half of the work that perception alone can't finish. That question, what is it asking of you, connects directly to what Jung called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming more integrated and less governed by inherited roles, old projections, and unconscious defenses you never chose in the first place. The shift you're sensing may represent a separation from a persona that no longer fits. It may represent shadow material finally getting acknowledged instead of denied. It may represent values that have genuinely changed, a need for firmer boundaries, a hunger for more honest relationships, or a slow movement toward a more integrated sense of self. And here is something worth remembering before you assume the shift requires you to blow your life up. Individuation doesn't always demand dramatic external change. Sometimes the change is a single honest conversation, a boundary you finally stated out loud, a refusal you've been too polite to give, a new habit quietly repeated, an admission you make to yourself before you make it to anyone else, a different relationship to the exact same life you already have. Not every transformation changes your surroundings. Some transformations change who you are inside them. So let's return, finally, to the phrase in the title and be precise about what it actually means, because it's easy to misread it as flattery. It doesn't mean you're psychic. It doesn't mean you're always right. It doesn't mean you were chosen for something everyone else was excluded from. It doesn't mean the people around you are somehow asleep and you alone are awake. What it means is narrower and more honest than that. You may be unusually sensitive to patterns that haven't become obvious yet. Patterns most people won't consciously register until much later, once the evidence is undeniable. You feel it first, not because you know the future, but because you are listening earlier. That's the whole claim of this video, stripped down to its center. Not prophecy. Attention. So here you are again, back where we started. The same room may still be there. The same people may still be around. The same routine may still be running exactly on schedule. But something in you may have already changed. Perhaps nothing visible has happened yet. Perhaps no door has closed and no new one has opened. Perhaps you still can't fully explain, even to yourself, what it is you're feeling. But if the feeling is quiet, if it's persistent, if it holds up under honest scrutiny, then don't rush to worship it, and don't rush to dismiss it either. Listen to it, test it, question it. Because sometimes the first sign of change isn't an event at all. It's the moment you can no longer pretend that everything feels the same. If this helped you understand why you often feel the shift before others do, subscribe for more explorations into Carl Jung, intuition, the shadow, individuation, and depth psychology.